the kind of cream on the top of the cake, the icing on the cake of what has been a good few months after a really tricky few months. And I said, oh, tell me more. And they proceeded to tell me the story of Sophie. Sophie was 17 at the time, and it all hinged on what happened within a sort of 12-hour window in her life. She'd gone off, so they thought, to her friend's house to have movies and pizzas and a bit of a sleepover. And Mum and Dad settled in for the evening, thinking that's really lovely. Sophie's out with her friends. The other two were younger and in bed. And then suddenly the phone rings. It's 10 o'clock at night. It's Sophie. The dad picks up the phone, except it's not Sophie. It's Sophie's friend. And in the background, you can hear loud thumping music. And he knows in that moment that Sophie's not at her friend's house, eating pizza, watching movie, about to have a sleepover. She's somewhere else. And this friend says, you've got to come quick because Sophie's in real trouble. She's had too much to drink, and I'm really worried about what might happen next. So the dad jumps up, grabs his keys, puts his shoes on, says to his wife, I'll call you from the car and explain what's happening. He jumps in the car, calls his wife, drives around to the address of the place where he knows he needs to go and get his daughter. He arrives, he sees what you can imagine from like a movie, like a teenage house party, right? He gets out of the car, he runs to the door. Sophie's friend is on the door waiting for him. He says, where is she? He says, she's in that room there. He runs in, he pushes past all these teenagers, picks up Sophie, who's had too much to drink, has really not got a clue what's going on, walks out of the house, says to her friend, come with me. She's got all of Sophie's stuff. They jump in the car. He drops his daughter's friend at home. On the way home, gets in through the front door, carries Sophie up to her bedroom where Mum takes over, gets her ready for bed, gets her into her bed, and then they come downstairs and they look at one another and they say, what now? The parable we just had read is a story that Jesus told. It's really the gospel in the gospel. It's a story about the transformative power of love. It's a story about an encounter with God's grace that was more than just an idea or a thought or a concept. Our faith, you see, is meant to be more than just head knowledge about God. It's meant to be heart knowledge of God. And in this new series that I'm kicking off this morning, in the mornings, we're going to be looking at these different encounters we see in the gospel accounts that people have with the grace of God, the grace of God, the unmerited favor, God's love, despite what we are or are not, and the different ways in which those encounters transform people. And it begins with knowing, you and I knowing that we are loved by God unconditionally. This has to be more than a thought in our head. God loves me, this I know, because the Bible tells me so. It's a good place to start, but it's not enough, because in the moments of doubt and shame, we have to have more than just a head knowledge. And we see in this story a father who expresses his actions and his words, with actions and with passion. Not just words, they're enacted with passion. I can say to my children, I love you. But unless they experience that through actions and with some passion, it's not necessarily going to change their life. Similarly, if we're to be to the people around us, if they're to know God loves them, they need to hear more than us just saying that. They need to experience through the way we love, our actions, and the passion with which that they too are loved. The word passion comes from the Latin word for passio, or the Greek word pathos, and it literally means to suffer. Our passion is that which we will suffer for. We'll come back to this later, but we talk, don't we, about the passion of the Christ in Holy Week. The suffering servant, Jesus. When we communicate love through actions that cost us, when we love with passion, people experience a transformative love that changes their hearts. And this is what Jesus did time and time and time again, right, in his earthly ministry. If you know the gospel accounts, think just for a moment about all the ways he went about loving people, the outcasts that he drew in. Think about the Samaritan woman at the well, or maybe the lady caught in the act of adultery, or little Zacchaeus, the tax collector up in the tree. He loved them with a passion, and it cost him. You and I are called to find ourselves in this story. These parables work on so many levels, but part of what we must do is go, where am I in this story? The parable of the lost son, or perhaps better known as the parable of the loving father, is this very well-known story if you've been around the church any length of time. What basically happens is that the son, the younger son, says to the father, I know what I want to do with my inheritance when you die. And actually, I'd like to do it now, if that's okay with you. Which is effectively like him saying to his father, you're dead to me. I wish you were dead so I could crack on with my life. And unexpectedly in the story, the father says, okay, you can take your inheritance early. It will bring huge shame on me and the family, but okay, you can have it. And so the son takes the money and heads off to a far-off land, as we heard. He spends the money recklessly in wild living until he finds himself with nothing, far from home, in a place hit by severe famine. He has to find some work, and so he ends up as a farm laborer feeding pigs. And that's an outrageous thing for Jesus to weave in the story, because to the Jewish people, pigs were unclean. So he's trying to shock them to go, this is how bad it got. And he ends up so hungry that he eats the food that the pigs were given to eat. And in that moment, he has an idea. Maybe, just maybe, I should head home. Now, he knows he can't go back as a son because he's already cut himself off from his parents and from the father. But he thinks, maybe I can go back as a farm laborer and I can earn some money. And maybe bit by bit I can earn my way back into my family, my loving father's home. That's, by the way, what we call religion, not grace. And so he heads for home, and we read in verse 21 that he's like rehearsing this speech of what he's going to say when he sees his father. Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son, but... And yet what happens, as you know in the story, is that the father's looking out and he sees the son heading home. And so he hoists up his robes and he runs out to meet him. And before the son can even say anything, he puts his arms around him and he says to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. He restores in that moment to the sonship, and he gives him the robe and the signet ring and the sandals, which were signs of sonship. And he kills the fattened calf, this one that they've been waiting to save up for some big occasion. Maybe just this moment. Maybe the father's been fattening the calf for the day when the son does come home. Maybe one day he might come home. I want to be ready. And so they have this almighty party. But this is not what the crowd are expecting Jesus to say when they hear this story. None of this makes any sense to them. What kind of father would be like that? Really? To understand more about this story, which on one level is simply a beautiful story, isn't it, about reconciliation, the power of a parent's love for a child. It works totally on that level. But as I said recently, parables work on a number of levels. We need to understand that in this story, there's a whole lot going on that actually when we understand its context, we go, oh my goodness, it's even better than I thought. We need to know three things. The first is that throughout the Old Testament, Israel, the people of God, have a name. And their name is Son of God, or God's Son. Some of you will remember the Exodus story where God says to Moses, you need to go to Pharaoh and ask to be set free. Ask for him to set my people free. And here's what he's told to say. Go to Pharaoh and say, this is what the Lord says. Israel is my firstborn son. So Israel is the firstborn son, right? And so what's going on in this moment is the crowd are hearing a story and they're going, hang on a minute, is he talking about us? Because aren't we the son? And they're starting to maybe think, maybe he's trying to help us understand what he's wanting to do for all of us as the people of God. You see, what happened is, despite this identity, if you know the story, God's people, they turn their back on him. They reject all that they have in God, and actually they find themselves in a far-off land, in a place called Babylon, where they're taken into captivity, where they're exiled, far from home. Now, by the time you get to Jesus, that's long since been returned. The people of God have come back, but actually they're still in a semi-state of exile. They're not fully reconciled to God. They're not living as he wants them to, which is why he sends Jesus in the first place, right? And so Jesus is trying to get their attention to say, you don't understand that the God of Israel, your God, Yahweh, he loves you with a passion. And you've not seen it and you've not responded. And I'm here to reveal it to you so that you can fully come all the way home. Here's the thing. You can be around God, but not know him. You can come to church and learn a lot about God, but never encounter him. And that's not what we're up for here. The second thing you need to know is that when this sort of story happened, when this sort of thing happened, what normally would happen is that the parents, the father particularly, because it was a very patriarchal society, would not have responded as the loving father does in this story. So when they hear this story told, they're like, no, that's not, no, what? Because what normally would happen is that when a son particularly left the home, rejects their inheritance, rejects their identity, rejects their sonship, and leaves, you would not be able to come back. Because you have cut yourself off. And you've put shame on your father and shame on your family, and by extension, shame on the community. And so what normally would happen is that when someone did dare to come back, they'd be met by the villagers, the community, who would perform what's called a kezazah ceremony. A kezazah ceremony, which is what basically what happened was they would meet this child returning on the edge of the village, the threshold of the community, and they'd say, you left. And what they would do is they'd take clay pots and they'd smash them on the ground in front of the son or the daughter as a symbolic way of saying, what you have done is irredeemable and irreparable. You have broken to pieces your relationship with your father. Shame on you. How dare you come back? Do not come any further. Now, the word kezazah literally means to cut off. So this was a ceremony that was declaring permanently, you chose this, and now we're reminding you. Now, interestingly, some of you will like this, the Greek word ostrakon, from which we get the English word ostracize, in other words, someone ostracizes themselves, cuts themselves off, that literally means in Greek, broken pottery. Why am I telling you this? Because the crowd, listening to the parable, are thinking, Jesus is telling our story. And you and I need to hear him telling our story too. See, they're expecting Jesus to say, as the son headed home, he was met by the villagers who threw down their clay pots and stopped him even attempting to connect with the Father. But that's not what they hear, so they're left going, so hang on. What? They're expecting Jesus to say, God is coming through me to perform the ultimate final Kezazar society, to declare once and for all, I've had enough, you've gone, you've rejected me. But instead, Jesus says something completely different. Because actually what he wants them to know and what we need to know is that this is not what God is like. God does not say, shame on you, you've cut me off, I want nothing to do with you. What Jesus is saying is the Father looks out with eyes of compassion, suffering love on his children because he loves them, because he loves them, because he loves them. And so they're listening to this and they don't understand. And you and I need to hear this and go, oh God, it has to be more than an idea in my head. You want me to experience grace and love in my heart. The third thing you need to know is that dignified Jewish men, they never ran. So this landowning father with servants would have been a well-to-do, dignified Jewish man in the story. You never hoist up your robes because it means exposing your bare legs. You just didn't do that. But in this story, he does, and he runs out to meet the son. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. And he ran to his son. They asked, the crowd listening are like, what? There's no Kezazar ceremony, and now the father runs, bringing shame onto himself? What is going on? And then, not only does he not perform this ceremony with his villagers, he actually puts his arms around him and restores him to sonship. They just don't get it. What is going on? It's the opposite of what they're expecting. And actually, it's the opposite of what most people, if we went out into the street now and said, what do you think God's like? What they would say in response. And actually, if we're really honest, I'm not sure we fully got it for ourselves. The son, ashamed from having found himself far from home, exiled from his father, is not the one humiliated by the Kezazar ceremony being performed. That doesn't happen. No, it's the father who becomes the humiliated one, who takes the shame upon himself by picking up his robes, exposing his legs and running. Why does he run? Typically, we've heard this and gone, because he just can't wait to see his son again. Yes, but also because he has to get to them. He has to get to his son before everyone else does. Because if he's not there first, they're going to come out with their clay pots and they're going to perform Kezazar on him, and he's not having that. And so he runs so damn quick to get ahead of them, to prevent that from happening. He's been watching and he's been waiting every day. I kind of imagine him like just every single moment, just trying to find that spot where he can see the furthest into the distance, wondering, waiting, praying, hoping. He's got the fattened calf. He's ready. He's got the new signet ring, the new sandals, the new robe. He's just waiting. And then one day, and he runs because he needs to know that he's going to get there first. And he gets there and he says, you are welcome here. You're welcome in my presence. The son is left in no doubt because of the actions and the passion of his father, that any words that he speaks are true. Which brings us back to 17-year-old Sophie, who wakes up the next morning quite late with a very sore head. And then she begins to kind of think, hang on, I'm not at my friend's house where I was meant to be in a sleepover. I'm home, and I'm not in the clothes that I wore last night. And it dawns on her that, oh heck, that means Mum and Dad must have found out what happened last night. And she said, I remember her saying, I didn't want to leave the room. I was so ashamed. I knew that I'd sinned against my parents and against heaven. But she said, I also knew that I had to go and face the music. So she came out of her room and she said, I could see my little brother and sister at the bottom of the stairs. They were on lookout. And as they saw me, she said, they jumped up and said, she's coming, with great excitement. And so she heads on downstairs and she can smell and hear noise. And she opens tentatively the kitchen door and into the kitchen diner. She described it beautifully. And she said, there on the table was this beautiful brunch. There's bacon and waffles and maple syrup and yogurt and croissants and fruit and coffee and her favorite smoothie. And then she notices there's balloons and she says, I remember that was exactly the brunch I had on my birthday. And she's looking at her parents and she's like about to, and they just put their arms around her apparently and just held her really tight and said, we love you. Take a seat. And she said, I just did not know what to do. But they like sit and have brunch. And she said to her parents, why? And I remember the dad saying to me, we got back downstairs that night and like, now what? And they prayed. And they were thinking, what would God do? And they remembered Luke 15 and the story of the lost son, which is actually a story about the loving father and actually the loving parents of Sophie. Therefore thought we need to do something similar. And so the dad got up early and went to the supermarket to buy all her favorite stuff so that when she came down, she would know that they'd covered over the sin and the shame with love and grace. That she would know the first thing that morning that she's loved, that she's loved, that she's loved, that nothing can separate her from their love. And she would know because they gave her all the things that communicated with actions their passion for her. It's a beautiful story. It come to the end of breakfast and she says, well, at least let me wash up. And they said, no, actually, we'd like you to go and get ready because Mum is going to take you out. And so Mum takes her out. They get in the car and Sophie says, where are we going? She said, I'm taking you to the shopping center, to the mall. You know, all those clothes that you've been saving up for, that new coat you want, those trainers you've been showing me, like, I'm going to go and buy them for you. And Sophie goes really quiet, apparently. And her mum says, do you not want to do this? And she said, I don't deserve this. And her mum's like, yeah, that's true, but that's not how it works. It's grace. And then Sophie said, the thing is, I also don't want that coat and those clothes and those trainers because they're not me. That was me trying to be someone I'm not, and I actually don't want to go and buy those. So her mum says to her, well, how about we go and find a different coat and some different clothes and some different new trainers, which is what happens. And Sophie had those trainers on, and she said, why? And her mum said, because every time you put on your shoes and your coat and you leave this house, we want you to know that you're our daughter, that you belong in this family. Can I tell you one more story? It's about a son who left home. He left his father's house and headed off to a far-off land. This son, he doesn't take his inheritance with him and cut himself off from the father because he doesn't love the father. He willingly went to this far-off land to be among those who found themselves feeding pigs, to the outcasts, to the excluded, to the poor, the lost, the lonely, the broken, to you and to me. Jesus didn't come with jars of clay to smash at the feet of humanity and to say, shame on you. You've rejected me. I don't want anything to do with you. No. He doesn't come to judge or to humiliate. He comes with words of grace, sure, but actually, more than that, he comes with actions that proved it. Actions that get outworked with the truest expression of passion. And so we read in John 3:16, God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. And then in 1 John 3:16, I don't think that's by accident. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. We don't need to fear Kezazar because Jesus faced it for us. We talk of Holy Week and Easter. As I said earlier, it's the passion of Jesus, the suffering love, a sequence of moments that build. So on the Friday, he finds himself taking on our shame, becoming the truly humiliated one, suffering unto death on a cross. God loves you is not just 3 words. It's the most powerful thing you could ever experience. He's the Father that runs out every single time you stray, even just a little bit, from his presence. He's the mum who takes you to clothe you with your new self. He's the Father that gets up early and makes you brunch. And so instead of experiencing shame and humiliation and rejection and being ostracized, quite the opposite happens through Jesus' offer to us. We get brought back in to the family. We each get given a new robe and a new signet ring and new sandals, and we are declared to be sons and daughters of God once and for all. Nothing separates us from the love of God. And instead of pots getting broken, it's actually the opposite. The grace of God fits back together all the broken bits of our life. Some of you will have heard of the Japanese art form kintsugi, which takes broken bits of pots and with gold puts them back together. And the idea is that it's more precious and beautiful than the original. The gold represents the grace of God. And in a moment, we're going to gather around the table, bread and wine, that remind us of that ultimate declaration of love. And while we prepare to do that, I want to show you, just finish with a little video explaining a little bit more about kintsugi. So let's watch that now.
The world is predicated upon mending what is broken, and this reality of how this kintsugi bowl is more valuable than the original really speak to the restorative, redemptive process of the gospel. Kintsugi is this art form of mending broken shards of pottery. Kin means gold and tsugi means to mend. So you are reconnecting the broken pieces, but doing it in a way that is beautiful, and it's an art form of its own. Kintsugi speaks about conditions of trauma and brokenness, ground zero conditions, valuing what you have rather than this disposable culture.
Kintsugi is not just fixing, but it's creating into an opportunity of brokenness, and so that is a redemptive journey that leads to new creation.
to me, how the gospel reads is Christ came not just to fix us, but to restore us, to create something new, which is more valuable than what we began with.